Guys, so happy to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm great, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, it's an honor that you took the time to appear here and sit down with me in order to make things better for other people. Question right away. What is it like to be Guy Winch at the moment? I cannot imagine what it must be like to live a life of your magnitude, and it must be so much on your plate. So, first question, instead of asking you, how are you, I would like to ask you, what is it like to be in your shoes at the very moment?
It's busy, and it means that I have to make a lot of choices about where I spend my time because there are a lot of options of what I can do, and I have to make choices based on what I think would serve the most people the best in that kind of way. So, but it's busy for sure.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to learn from you was I'm not only like a coach, but also an entrepreneur, which means that when I sit with clients, I usually have to be a somewhat slower person. But the entrepreneurial mind is like, you have to do this, this, and this, and there are always like 10,000 tabs open, and I really struggle with changing from that one personality to the next one. So I wanted to ask you right away out of my stomach is, how do you balance being a therapist while also being a global prominent figure, so to say? Because those are very different demands from what I feel.
Yes, when you're, for example, giving a talk on stage or these days virtually, though sometimes in person, then you have to be very up and you have to be very big and you have to be animated and excited and invigorated. And when you're doing psychotherapy, which is what I do, then you actually have to be calm and in listening mode. And I mean, I'm an active therapist in that way, but you have to be in listening mode. And when I do my podcast, Dear Therapists, in which we do live therapy sessions, then it's this combination of I have to be a therapist, but this is a podcast, so I have to think of those, those prerogatives as well, or those priorities rather as well. Like what would be good for a podcast, not just what would be good for therapy, and so different mindsets. But I find that when I switch from one meeting to another or from one task to another, it takes me like a minute, but I can just clue in. I just focus in on what's my task. I remind myself when I switch, like, here's my task. This is the person I'm going to talk to next. This is what their issues are. This is what they really need from me. So I just remind myself in what way I need to be present and what the expectation is.
Yeah, I love that. I have to write down before my sessions every time who do I need to be for that particular person in the moment, because otherwise I feel like I put too much of my energy onto the client and not serving, but rather have them participate in my life, not the other way around, and I don't do my job then. Anyway, let's start with the interview. Question in mind. What was the first sign for you that you would tell you that you would become a psychologist? Or maybe a sign for others, like an early symptom that made you feel like, oh, maybe I'm more interested than I thought I was.
I knew by high school that I wanted to be a psychologist. I would observe other people around me. I would observe my parents. I would observe other people. I would observe their interactions. And when you look at other people and you look at their interactions, you notice much more than you do when you're in the interaction yourself. And so I would notice, for example, miscommunications that, oh, they intended this, I'm very sure, but it wasn't received that way, or the misunderstandings or manipulations or different kinds of things. And I was just very curious as to what's going on behind the scenes in someone's head.
Mm.
So that kind of started an interest in psychology about why we do the things we do. Why are people doing that way? Why does this person lie a lot and doesn't feel bad about it? And this person so truthful, and the liar is getting ahead of the truthful person. So that's interesting, and just questions like that. I just fascinated me, and it was very clear to me from again high school that I wanted to study this.
What did you grow up? What was it like for you to grow up? Like, what was your childhood like?
Well, I'm an identical twin. So for me, that was the most prominent aspect. There were only two of us, my brother and I. And when you're identical twins, it chases you everywhere you go. To this day, this week, my brother and I were in a supermarket, and the cashier at the supermarket literally did, "Oh, you twins," and I'm like, "Really? Even at this age, we get the oh?" Does it not stop? But it's like that was that was what life. Everywhere you go, everyone's like, "Oh," And my parents did the unforgivable thing of dressing us alike till we were maybe old enough to object. So that really makes you some kind of vaudeville act wherever you go. So yeah, so that was the most notable thing about my childhood. The twinship was very prominent.
What is something you learned from your parents? One of the things I'm always interested in is how the first teachers we all have formed us, whether it's our parents, our caretakers, and I think they have a big impact on the personality to develop on forwards. Like, what are some lessons, can be good or bad ones, that you learned from either one of your parents? If that's okay for me to ask, of course.
Yeah, but the lesson I learned first, I think I did learn from my brother. And that lesson was, and it's going to sound really sappy and, a little like, if you have violins, this would be the time to play them, because the answer there is that it's about unconditional love. Like, I learned very early that we could get into an argument as siblings, but the minute we left the house and went to school, if anyone picked on me, he would be right there to support me, even if we just had an argument. That lesson was in a real-time situation. We were also in the same classroom for some reason. I don't know what teachers were thinking, but we were in the same classroom all through high school.
Okay.
And we were identical. Teachers couldn't even tell us apart. I don't know why they did that. But so our lives were very entwined in friends and otherwise. But that was the lesson I learned. Like, when you have somebody who just loves you unconditionally, is there for you unconditionally, and it can be a sibling. It doesn't have to be a parent. There is power in that. There is something magnificent in that makes you feel, gives you a certain base of steadiness, no matter what happens.
One of the things I grew up rather limited resources. My parents weren't very rich, and I had a victim's mentality for a big chunk of my life, I would say. And one of the things I always took for granted that psychotherapy taught me when I work with other people was, I had two people who loved me and who I always could return to. When I found people who didn't have that, it just blew my entire sense of appreciation apart, because it's very hard to repair the feeling that you are alone in the world. I would feel, and so that's a beautiful story. It's just have someone who has your back and who's identical with you. What's a failure or a setback in your upbringing that prepared you for later success in your life? Any story that comes to mind where you overcame something that later taught you some lessons that you needed to know in order to be the person that you are today? Does that question make sense to you?
Yes, but I'm going to go to a little bit, in my young adulthood rather than childhood. Because in childhood, I was a terrible student. I was a terrible student throughout, high school. Both of us were bad students. We both have PhDs today, but we were not good students. But when I finished my undergraduate, my BA degree, and I applied to universities, I knew I wanted to get a PhD. I knew I wanted to study in New York City. I sent in my applications, and I found, I think, 10 roughly whatever programs for PhDs in and around New York City. 9 of them were quite good. One of them wasn't great. And I sent in my application, and 9 of them rejected me. And the 10th one that wasn't that great never even responded. And I didn't even get a no from them. It was apparently no way, no. And I was very devastated at first, because I thought, wow, this is my dream, to go and study in New York and get a PhD, and everyone is saying no, and maybe I'm not cut out to be a psychologist, was my first thought, because that failure makes you feel like, again, usually the process is they do interviews. I didn't even get an interview. It was just an outright no. And so it was very demoralizing. And I remember my first, day, I was just upset and distressed and didn't know what to do next. And the next morning I woke up and I'm like, I realized they didn't reject me. They rejected my application. My application was what it was. I could improve it. It was a way in which I realized, I literally took it as a personal thing where they didn't even see me. This was before the internet. So you literally sent in documentation. That's what they rejected. So I was then able to figure out where my documentation was weakest, improved it, spent the year improving it, reapplied, and got in to a lot of places. And that was a lesson, because that moment where I realized it's not me, they don't know me. It's whatever they saw, even if in this case it was just paperwork, that can be improved. And this idea of, if you want something bad enough, there are no walls there. There are only obstacles. You can go around them. It might take you a long time to figure out how to do it, but there's a way around them almost all the time if you're motivated enough to put in the work to find it and to execute it.
That sounds like a very handy philosophy, particularly for all the judgment that is aimed at your way. One of the things that I struggle with at the moment is I launched yesterday the beta version of the university I was founded. Lots of writing programs from me are on that platform. And all I get from the last 24 hours are bugs and mistakes and spelling mistakes. I'm like, oh my God, it's like so much rejection. And I have been not sleeping at all last night because I still have this infantile narcissism of like, another person who tells me I'm not good enough, another person tells me I'm not good enough. And I feel that if you can dissociate yourself from the idea, like not everything is about you, and people make choices based on what they are doing, you can let a lot of past trauma behind, like that one person maybe who left you, or that father wasn't there for you, or that job that didn't reject you. And it's not taking ourselves too seriously is really, I think, like a necessity in life, I feel, in a way.
Anyway. I agree about not taking yourselves too seriously, but again, I think it's about that same principle of being able to divorce your, your products, in this case, the product that you launched, from who you are. And again, products are going to have faults, and humans have faults, but the fact that the product has faults, if there are typos and spelling mistakes, obviously that would make me crazy as well, but it happens all the time in my social media. That something's been out there for 2 days and I go, spelling mistake, typo, and it drives me up the wall. But at some point, you can't get crazy about it, because it's like, okay, it makes me human.
Yeah, I had a great podcast guest in my last talk who Nadadine Asayal, and she taught me that she had like 150 speaking gigs already, and she never was nervous, and she taught me that because she was a professional singer before, her mantra is, this isn't about me, I try to give something to the audience. So like, again, the dissociation from narcissism seems to be something really curative. In terms of when we speak about psychology, Guy, when you think of the word outstanding, what psychologist comes to mind? Any mentor story where somebody helped you to discover your own voice that you admired in your earlier life, just like what this is happening right here, but in your life?
Yeah, I'm in touch with one of my professors from graduate school, and I graduated probably around 30 years ago, so that's been a while. But this was the professor who interviewed me for the program at New York University. He became my supervisor, my advisor, my friend. And he, was someone who was very difficult to read. He was this like handsome black man. And throughout the whole interview, in my entry interview, it was like I couldn't get him to, like, it was like nothing changed on the face. I couldn't tell how I was doing. I would try a joke. No. I would try this. Did he seem interested? No. He just seemed very, very matter of fact, very poker face throughout. And then when I got in, we became friends. And one of the things that I said to him in my first session was, I'm not sure I believe in psychotherapy based on my experiences so far in life. And yet here I am doing a 6-year program to get a doctorate in that. Is that stupid of me to tell you that? I said to him. And he's like, no, because it's based on the experiences you've had. And if you've had bad therapists or a bad therapist, then you'll think poorly of the profession, as, unfortunately quite a few people do. And then when you have a good one, you'll realize, oh, you can actually help people. So since I'm the supervisor now, let's help you get that other experience of feeling like, oh, you can actually help people. But he wasn't put off by it. And the lesson he taught me there was like, it's okay to question things. It's important to question things, and it's important to work with people who aren't threatened by the questions that you have and are happy to explore them and answer them. And that's where the real growth happens, not in just accepting things at face value, just, okay, being the good student who just takes in everything. At some point in life, you have to, you need to make sure it makes sense to you, question it. It's okay to be skeptical. And as long as you're working with people who can tolerate that, you'll learn way more.
failure is a great teacher, I feel, particularly in psychotherapy. One of my personal idols is Jeffrey Kotler. He's a psychotherapist. I don't know if you know him. He wrote like 170 books about psychotherapy. Wow, 140, something like this. So more than I can count, let's say it. And he wrote two great books that I can recommend to anybody. It's like The Finest Hour, where therapists share their best case studies, but also Bad Therapy, like where therapists share their worst failures. And I wanted to ask you two questions basically. What do you feel was your finest hour as a therapist? And what do you feel was your most memorable failure inside your therapy practice? And what did you learn from both of those things? If that would be okay for me to
Cool.
ask you.
The second one is going to take some thinking. Look, the first one, I'm going to answer it this way. I'll just be very blunt about this. I'm expensive as a therapist, and so I am highly aware that a lot of people who are coming to see me, this is a lot of money for them, and they want to get something out of it. A lot of people come to see me just for one session. They just want to get my take on something, or they want help, but they're coming for one session. It's called a consultation model. We call it in psychotherapy. So for me, my finest hour is when every time I see one of those people who's only coming once, and I have one session to hear their story and do something with them that makes them feel like, well, that was worth it. Every time we end the session and they literally look at me and say some version of, well, that was worth it, that's my finest hour. And there are lots of hours like that, which is
Very
fun.
diplomatic answer, I feel. Good answer, but diplomatic one. I feel that also our clients, and this is one of the things that I love about the field of psychology and psychotherapy, is I cannot believe that people pay me to listen to their stories because it's so bloody interesting. And I would do that for free, but I feel very privileged that I get paid to do something that I love. I believe our clients are our greatest teachers. Like, does any client stand out who taught you something about yourself, about the world, or about life that comes to mind when I ask you this question right now?
Again, this is going to sound diplomatic again, but I really learn from so many of my clients. Here's one example of a genre of learning that's been really interesting for me. Since I've been doing it for a long time, and since I've had a lot of clients over the years, a lot of times I've had a client who's been in a situation that I've never been in before. But it is clear to me what the issues are, what they need to do, what, like how to navigate that situation. And it's also a little bit more clear to me because I'm not in it. So I have more objectivity, etc. And then I find myself a year, a month, 10 years, 20 years later in that situation. And I immediately recognize that, well, you know what you need to do because you've been telling that to people, so that is amazing, right? It's like, you get a trial run for life. It's not a trial run because I'm doing psychotherapy work. But look, just to answer, I'm going to go back to your previous question and give you a finest hour because there was one recently. So I feel let's not be diplomatic all the way. I got invited in October to be the first in-person guest at 10 Downing Street to speak to the UK government, the government in the United Kingdom, and to speak to policymakers. And what they said to me was, come tell us what policies we should enact for mental health in the UK. And I'm like, generally, you mean broadly what you should do? And they said, yeah. And I said, okay, since you're asking. And that was a great honor to be going there. But the finest hour part was that it was my goal. I thought these are policymakers. They might do something. They're only going to do something, though. Or not only, but they're more likely to do something if they are personally invested in the outcome. If this is something they would find personally valuable, oh, this policy, if we have it, I would benefit from it too. My relationships would, my children would, something like that. And so I drafted a talk that was talking about policies in a highly personal way to them, asking them questions about, did you know, for example, that couples therapists can predict divorce with accuracies of 95% because of certain variables that we follow? Do you know what those variables are? No, they said. I knew they would say no. And I said, would you like to know? And they said, yes. And I said, so would everyone who's married in the UK. We can tell them, we just don't do it right now. But you could with certain policies for education. You're giving out marriage licenses. There's a lot of information you can give out with a marriage license, by the way. A lot of information you can give out with a birth certificate about parenting. We don't know it all, but we know a lot. And so it was all, and so it was very personal as well as policy. And the finest hour part was that it got through to them. They were very much interested on a personal level, and that felt useful. That felt like, oh, good. I was able to not just do something up here, but something down there, and that makes me hopeful that maybe something will come of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I never thought of the idea that maybe you should do a like give out like a little briefing. Here is how you not fuck up the marriage once you engage in it. That's like even I love that you can just have one talk, and like I heard about you like many other people about the TED talk about how to heal a broken heart on YouTube, and one of the things I couldn't stop investigating was the numbers of people that watched that video. And it's one of my dreams to help people at scale. And I couldn't believe that there was every person who watched that got something out of it. And maybe even some of these people like shared it with other people and tell their story. So the therapeutic impact through technology was, I think about that a lot. And it's my greatest dream to, I don't know, how many people did you help in your life? It's really hard to put a number on it.
Well,
reach, right?
Until I started doing TED Talks, it was one by one. 2 by 1, if it's a couple. My first TED Talk is called Why We Need to Practice Emotional First Aid. It has 12 million views. It is because of that talk on TED.com that the owner of TED, Chris Anderson, said to me, I want to talk about heartbreak. He said, we are a huge platform. We don't really have something there. I want you to write something that does this. That when somebody who's heartbroken sees it, they finish it and they have some hope. Can you write that? And I said, yeah, but he said, but I'm going to give that talk in Vancouver in their annual conference in front of every tech founder and celebrity, and Al Gore is sitting there, and Bill Gates, and all these other people, none of whom is especially heartbroken. So I said, that would be gangbusters online, I'm sure, but I don't know how to make it interesting for people who are not. And but his goal was, he goes, there's so many people hurting, I want to give them hope. And that was the goal of that talk. It was written with that very specific goal in mind. It wasn't just, oh, isn't this interesting? It went, and I used just a literary device to go from, I used the we pronouns. When we're heartbroken, this is what happens in our brain when I was giving the information. And when I was, there are places where I give very specific advice, and then I say, so if your heart is broken, you need to do, and I went back and forth from the we for the people in the room to the you for the people at home, and it's in 12 minutes. So that's, a lot to kind of condense. This was an editing task, especially because you say a lot and then you have to bring it down to 12 minutes. But his goal was, and when he said it, I'm like, all right, I don't know, if that's going to be that useful, but people, who are heartbroken don't watch that talk once. They watch it many, many, many times because it's a little pellet of hope for them each time. And they hear a little bit of something new or pay attention to another nuance in what I'm saying. And that has felt incredibly gratifying to know that talk has over, 13 million views on TED.com, which includes, by the way, the YouTube, but also other outlets. So to know that, and then I have a third talk. Between the three, there's 30 million views of these talks, and to know that 30 million people might have benefited from my work, plus I have books and my podcast, and that is very gratifying, because that's the mission, to see if I can use my expertise to relieve some suffering. So that's useful.
Thank you. Really, it's not just for delivering that talk and helping so many people, but it's people like you who came before me who showed the world that we can help at scale are very inspiring, because now with the university, for example, I don't know if somebody who lived 30 years ago who was like an aspiring therapist who would write books, who would know that this is a possibility. Hey, if you give it your all, like you might make a gift to all of humanity and to a larger chunk of people. So people like you really paved the way, like to think on a higher level of consciousness. So it really touched me a lot, and I'm going to bug you with a couple of questions over the next years in order to learn how to do that already. Anyway, You mentioned an interesting word in order to describe your talk, hope. And one of the things that I notice about that talk is rather than giving people hope, you allow these people to let their hope die in a way,
Yes,
right?
that's a good point.
There's yeah, because for me is when I discovered this talk, I was heartbroken as well, and I have really struggled giving up on things. And I found some romanticism in fighting for something that was already dead. And after your talk, I had the image of like a soldier who mourns like a fellow comrade, and where if I would talk to that person, I could, after watching your talk, I could talk to him. It might look like courage if you stay here and hold his hand, but you're going to die and you need to move on because it is a form of strange cowardice that is underneath because you are unwilling to let something go that is meant to be left behind. And particularly your comparison that you compared heartbreak to addiction was something that made all the difference for me because like I'm a former alcoholic and cocaine addict, and this is how I came in touch with behaviorism. It's like this is how I developed all the tools because I needed to change myself and I knew how to treat addiction and habits, and then was like, okay, I put it in the wrong box. If this is the treatment plan, I can change my course, and I created an intervention that is based on the same pillars as addictive therapy, and that made all the difference for me. And um, thank you for that. I just wanted to highlight that. It's like it really helped me. So I hope lots of people. I put it in the show notes so other people can watch as well. So we get all the clicks
Thank
that
you.
are
Yeah,
available on
there's
YouTube for that
literally a
video.
line in that talk that I wrote that goes, "Hope can be very destructive when your heart is broken." And that's
Yeah,
true. And you're right. I mean, the talk is supposed to give people hope, but also take away that hope. It's supposed to give them hope that they can move forward and take away the hope that they'll be moving forward with the person who broke their heart.
yeah, beautiful. I would like to move on to the next section of the interview and ask you a couple of questions because I know that we're on the clock. I'm writing a book right now that's called Ultimate Therapy, and it's based on a dream that I had where I was counseled by a therapist, and I was waiting for the therapist to come in. And the first person that came in was Sigmund Freud, and he helped me to alleviate myself of my mommy issues. And then when he would like the next one would come in and was Carl Rogers, and he helped me to accept myself. The next one was Frankl. He helped me to build a vision out of things. And I'm making a book out of that. And I would like to ask you a couple of questions in regards to the pioneers of the past in order to just have your views on it. Would that be okay?
Yes.
Cool. One of the people that I write about that book, who is like you, a clinical phenomenon in the world, is Jordan B. Peterson. I like him a lot, and it's like I only know the two of you who really have so many views that it's impossible to calculate. So there's something that the two of you have in common in terms of a phenomenal standpoint. One of the things that Peterson was famous for in his times as a clinician was that he would only form an alliance or a covenant with that part of his clients that wanted to have the best for them in a way. So he was not like somebody like Rogers who had an unconditional regard, but he would only accept them to a certain degree. And I would be interested if you and Dr. Peterson would be in charge of a psychiatric facility. Where would you agree upon in terms of the intervention, and where would you get nose to nose and have a fight with it?
I would agree with the I would agree with the principle and do the intervention differently. I mean, I agree with that very much. That I think psychology in general was, started off by looking at pathology all the time and ignoring strengths. And there's a field of positive psychology which looks at happiness and how people can, but people have strengths, and those strengths balance out their weaknesses or their pathology, if you want to call it that. But they're not. When you look at the DSM, at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where we actually create these diagnoses for the field of psychiatry, strengths are not allotted room. It isn't based. It's a symptom-based, medical-based thing. It's like very much you just look at cancer. But what about if you could measure somebody's immune function? Would that not matter? In psychology, we can't measure numerically. I mean, we can with questionnaires, but we can look at strengths, and they should balance out the picture very well. So this is where I agree with him, that appealing to those strengths is important. I don't have a contract where I just, dealing with that. What I do is I convey to the person very, very clearly and throughout the session, throughout the therapy, that I see those strengths and I'm talking to those strengths. I'm appealing to those strengths. I bring them in, and I can be supportive on the weaker parts. I can be supportive about the parts where people can't, make the moves they need to make yet, etc. But I will talk to them as people who also have strengths that they can bring to the fore, that they can utilize, that they can bring into the battle. And in that sense, I think we both agree on that we really, you have to work with people's strengths as much as, if not exclusively, but not exclusively, I think, but as much as you work with people's weaknesses.
One of the things that I'm more mindful of lately, Guy, is to be very careful of what I aim at with my life, because sometimes you get what you want and sometimes it wasn't that noble in its character. I aim particularly at emulating people like you, like Dr. Peterson. And one of the things that I noticed particularly about Dr. Peterson is the toll the limelight and helping at scale takes on the individual. He was sick, he nearly died, and I can't help but think that it has to do something with the amount of responsibility he tried to adopt. This is something I wanted to ask you, like, how are you protecting yourself from being crushed under the burden that you're permanently trying to lift up? And what kind of advice would you give maybe like a younger version of yourself in order to, in that regard, to take care of yourself for yourself and not for other people? Because I feel that we are trained in a way to let all of our needs at the door, and like it's client based, world based. We help, and there's little room for the word I, which is noble, but it can cause severe side effects. And I'm worried about that, particularly in terms of, will I ever have a stable relationship? Can I be a good father? Can I be a good friend if I orientate myself outwards? What are your thoughts on that, Guy?
So my third TED Talk is called How to Not Think About Work During Your Free Time. And in it, I start with a story of what happened the year after I opened my practice. And I opened my practice and filled it very quickly. I was very fortunate. And within a year, I was very burnt out. I was very, very burnt out. It was psychology all the time. It was seeing patients. It was teaching classes. It was doing supervision. It was doing extra training. It was all day. And I started my practice. So I was all gung-ho. And then this is what I spent so many years in school. Now I finally get to do it after many, many years in school. So I was doing it. And it took me a year to realize I was miserable. There's an incident, people can see it in the TED Talk, but I was ridiculously rude to a neighbor in an elevator. I was, coming home, and it was a hot day, and my neighbor worked in an ER. He was a physician, and I didn't realize how done I was, how depleted I was. And then the elevator shuddered and stalled between floors, and I was like, oh, I just want to get home. I'm not phobic about elevators. I'm not claustrophobic. So just like, and he panicked and he started smacking the door and pouncing there and going, this is my nightmare. This is my nightmare. And what I said, again, not kind, not good, was, this is my nightmare. Because, somebody having a panic attack in an elevator with me was my rendition of nightmare, which I actually said aloud. And it did calm down because it pissed him off. But the point being that was not the intention. But it made me realize, like, I am a kind person. What is going on that I would say something so unkind in a moment where I knew exactly how to calm him down? I could have done it. And that's when I realized, oh, crap, I am burnt out. And so really in year one, and since then, I have been highly aware of making a balance between my own emotional needs, my own life, and my work. And I have various trigger like levels, where alarm triggers, where if I feel certain things in certain contexts, that's the sign that I'm over scheduled. That's the sign that I crossed the line into too much. And so I know myself well enough over the years. It's the same things that keep happening. And that's my sign, and I immediately will back off something. I immediately go to my skill, like, I need to drop something now. Like what? And I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about one, satellite project or something, to give myself more breathing room. I need to prioritize, really recharging and all of that. So it's something that I fight and I monitor all the time. I'm under threat of it all the time, and I am actively trying to manage that threat all the time. It's not something that you learn and now you're good. It's an ongoing battle.
That was so helpful right now, and I would think about that a lot. Speaking of shadow possession, in a way where the worst of us or the most violent aspects like come forth, one of the chapters in my book that took told on me was writing about Carl Jung, because that dude is complicated. I think he wrote for people who are smarter than me, but it took me almost a year just to digest it. But one of the questions that Carl Jung thought everybody should ask themselves was, what myth are you living? Like that every individual could think about that. And I wanted to ask you, if you could make a cup and make a question on the coffee mug for everybody in the world, what would you put on top of that? What's a question you feel people should ask themselves more often?
It's gonna sound stupid but I'll explain it. The question is, who are you? Here's why. It doesn't matter as much who we are. It matters who we believe we are. And that belief determines our perceptions, our experiences. It is the narrative of our lives that we have in the back of our mind in a sometimes unconscious, preconscious way that really determines how we go about the world. Here's one quick example. You're a survivor of a horrific plane crash and you lost both legs. Now you're the sole survivor. What is your story there once you recovered a bit? Is it that I'm the unluckiest person in the world because I became disabled and I became an amputee and I lost my legs? Or am I the luckiest person in the world because I actually survived the plane crash? I was the only one. And some people are going to immediately feel they're the most lucky person in the world, and some are immediately going to feel victimized and like this is the most terrible thing that's happened. And that is going to make a big difference in their recovery. It's going to make a big difference in their mindset. And it doesn't just operate when they're in a plane crash. This is what operates. They have been either a lucky person or somebody who things work out for before in their narrative. And the other people have been things that they're always victimized and things always don't work for them, right? When I didn't get into graduate school the first year, what was my narrative? Am I like an unlucky person? No, my narrative is like, you're going to hit a lot of obstacles, figure your way around them, that kind of thing. So that narrative that we have in our head is related to our identity, to who we think we are and how we are in the world, how we became that way. And we do not have a good take on that. When I ask people that question, you can go with demographics, or sometimes say, well, I'm kind, and then suddenly, we're doing your dating app, profile where you're the person who walks on the beach at sunset and riding horses. And I'm like, really? That's who you are as a person? It's probably an aspect, but there's more to you. So getting in touch with who we are, what's our story in our own head? How do we think of ourselves in the world? And then tweaking that is what needs to come next. That's a little bit more difficult to put on a coffee mug. But that question of like, how are you seeing yourself in the world? And is that how you want to see yourself in the world? Are you a victim? Are you somebody who's a survivor? Are you somebody who fights their way through? Or are you somebody who gets frustrated very easily and lets things go? Like, what is your story? And kind of getting in touch with that can be a really useful thing. And therapy, certainly, because there's a whole school of therapy called narrative therapy, but in life.
Yeah, one of the biggest contributions from Jung for me personally was the idea that people don't have stories, stories have people, and that the quality of these stories determines the quality of your life. And it's one of the things that is so interesting for me is I have met so many people who had like a victim's mentality, particularly after heartbroken, for example, where no matter how many references they collect that they are an attractive, good person, they reject all the data and they are obsessed with that one thing that is congruent with their narrative. And it's no matter how much work that person does, until the person identifies and makes like a cost-benefit analysis of that particular belief, you know where they are going. And that was very interesting for me to discover that not only individuals, but all of mankind has a story, in that we should be very careful what kind of stories we act out with. Which is why I wanted to ask you about yourself and Jordan Peterson. Is like, if I adopt the role of trying to change the world, is that gonna come at a side effect of me losing happiness? Is that come at a side effect of me losing other human needs of myself? Which is very interesting, because particularly, for example, I'm a CEO now, and that is an identity, and that usually comes with with the perception like, I don't have free time. I work on Sundays. I work 100 hours a week. It's a lot of demands, and I feel that I have to be really careful what kind of identities I adopt, because they determine what my life will be like, in a way.
But I'm
Anyway,
sorry, just I want to make that like more complicated for you.
please,
Unfortunately,
please.
because whenever I talk to successful people, they've all, a lot of them, not all of them, a lot of them have basically had the idea of, I'm just going to outwork everyone around me. I'll get there first because I'll work harder. I know that was my mindset, you know, when I came to the US and I was in graduate school and it was very competitive, and I'm like, I'll work harder. I'll catch up that way. And I think that that's something you have to do periodically, but you have to monitor. In other words, yeah, there are certain times I will have to throw myself into something and really work ridiculous hours and be quite exhausted for a month or for two, because this is important to, you know, and it's not going to get off the ground. But then I will really work in massive breaks and time off and vacation and, you know, try and do it that way. But the idea of, you know, CEOs, entrepreneurs, and successful ones are just willing to work extremely hard is a reality, really.
Mhm.
I think, for a lot.
Yeah, I thought so, honestly. I think that it's like part of the price you have to help, because I feel that, for example, if you didn't have that episode where you sacrifice the entirety of your being for your craft, maybe that TED Talk wouldn't exist. And maybe millions of people wouldn't have found a way to like let go of their past. And who knows, maybe that's worth it. I'm not sure yet. I have to think about that some more. Guy, you made a very interesting point that reminded me of a story where with the person who had the plane crash, who lost its legs. Do you know Hugh Herr? Like that's one of the people that
Hugh
Hugh
Herr?
Herr.
No.
Hugh Herr. He's a scientist at MIT, I feel, who lost his legs at a climbing accident, and he loved climbing very much. And one of the things he did as a consequence that very much inspired me is he built himself
Yes, I have. I've
robotic.
seen his TED Talk. I've seen his TED Talk. Yes, sorry, I'm
Yeah,
not great with the names, but yes, I know that.
well, I'm also not good with the pronunciation, so you're excused. So that was probably my mistake. Anyway, he infuses suffering with meaning, not only by giving himself the ability to walk again, but he made the decision to not stop finding a solution so that he can give that to other people. And that inspires me a lot, because like that single-mindedness. And I wanted to ask you, was there an episode in your life where your belief was tested? And how did you overcome that particular test of faith of yours, if that makes sense?
What kind of belief do you mean?
In moving forward, in spite of the suffering that was sent your way in that particular chapter of your life, like a story where you were one of the hardest episodes of your life, where in overcoming it, you set the foundation for future, for lack of better words, character that was developed.
No, there's not one in which I've had hardship in my life. I also come from a poor family. I didn't have much growing up at all. You know, the kind of family, it's like one pair of shoes a year. And if your toes are going to hurt by the end of the year. And no, never went on vacation as a kid. Like it was, you know, worked since I was 12. And I'm very driven. If I want something, I have this unfortunate thing from a young age that I feel like if I work hard enough and figure it out, I can get it. And then I feel compelled to do that. And so I'm constantly seeing that I can get there. I just need to put in the work. And it's just about, you know, putting your head down and getting the work done when you're hitting these hard moments, or, you know, certain hard moments, you know, that you need to stop and lick your wounds and kind of nurture yourself for a little bit, but then you get back up. There hasn't been a point in which I gave up on anything or felt like, oh, this can't be for me, or here's a goal that I will never reach. I've not had that experience. I'm very fortunate, I guess, but I haven't.
Hopefully not. Maybe it's going to happen to you in the future. Then I want to ask you that again. Hopefully not, though. I feel that one of my favorite quotes, I don't know if it's Socrates who said that tough fortune if you bear it nobly, it's good fortune. Something like this. It's like the idea that like the ultimate character is the result of ultimate testing
That's
in a
what
way.
emotional
I think
resilience is about. Emotional resilience is acquired through overcoming hardship. And by the way, let me just throw something out there I want your listeners to be aware of. If you think of the pandemic, for example, we've all been through hardship. Now, let's think of two people who really went through a very, very difficult, identical experience in the pandemic, but very, very difficult one. And one of them gets through the pandemic and says, well, that was terrible. That was just terrible. And the other one gets through and says, that was just terrible. That was just terrible, but I made it through. That addition of acknowledging the resilience is going to make all the difference in the resilience that they build as a result of the experience. We build resilience from hardship, but we really build it when we acknowledge it, when we can see it, when we can remember it, when we can account for it, and when we can assume it going forward. If we're not acknowledging it, and I know too many people who actually get through hardship and never give themselves the credit for it and never build resilience, and that's a miss, and that's a shame. So, hardship does build resilience, but you have to see it and you have to acknowledge it for that to be a thing.
that's beautiful. And I would like to add one message for our listeners. Please also give humanity credit for the many, many challenges that we overcame. Many of the people that I talk to have very bad beliefs about us as a general. I think that we live in a belief system that is very resent driven in a way. It's like, oh, I recently did a study, like an assessment on my Instagram stories, how many people believe that humans are the cancer of the planet. And it was like 68% of people who believed that, and more than 500 people participated. And that really gave me plenty of things to thought about. So I feel that if we overcome this pandemic, and let's also look at how great we are at overcoming things and not so at also only our mistakes.
Well,
because we are pretty amazing, I feel.
Yeah, but let me just throw out there that those 60-something% are absolutely correct. When you look at climate change and what we're doing to the planet, we are the cancer of the planet. Certainly that's true to other species. The planet itself will rebound even if we screw it up and die in the process. But other species are not going to be that lucky. So in that sense, we are a cancer. And after the pandemic, we will still have now, but hopefully we'll be able to pay attention to the looming emergency we have of climate change. And that's something that's going to affect everyone who's alive today.
You're absolutely right. But I think that we still have what it takes in order to overcome that. One last question, and I would like to give you a couple more minutes so that you can recuperate from this interview before your next client comes up. It's one of the last chapters in the book that I'm writing is about Viktor Frankl. He's my personal idol and one of the persons that I would have loved to interview the most. And for people who don't know who Viktor Frankl is, he was a Jewish therapist who was deported to Auschwitz, who instead of surrendering to his unjustified punishment said, how can I make the situation better? How can I help other people here? And what he did in the camps of Auschwitz, for example, was to be the therapist in the camps. And one story I would like to share with you and ask you a question afterwards. There was a geologist, for example, who had defeat written all over his face, who wanted to run into the fences. And that was like a code for, I do not want to live anymore, because he knew that he would shoot themselves. And Frankl talked to him and say, what do you want to kill yourself? And he said something like, I don't have anything out of life to expect anymore but pain. And Frankl asked him one question that I thought was so beautiful. He said, could it not be that life is expecting something out of you? It's like very different perspective where he adopted responsibility, and that helped that geologist in order to discover, I have a book that I have to finish to write. I have a family. I have to move forward. So it's a different of mindset. And I want to ask you as a last question, has there been a very tough client in your past where you helped that particular individual to turn their perspective around and stance that was a very meaningful case study to you, if that makes sense as a question? Because I feel like sometimes our hardest clients are also the most meaningful ones, looking back at it, even if it doesn't feel on that particular day.
Yeah, but many. Again, there are many. It's been 30 years, and I've been working all the time, and I've met many people, and so there are quite a few that, and I have this thing where a lot of the clients I've worked with over the years will send me New Year's cards, and about their life. Years and years after we stopped working together, there's one man I worked with in 1993, I think, for a year. Every year I got a card, and then I get the card about, with a picture from his wedding. Then I get a card with a picture of his baby. And then 3 years ago, I get a call, and it's the baby, who's now 20. And he needs therapy. And his dad said, well, I know the person you should go to. And,
Beautiful.
And it turns out that this dude who I was, seeing at the time turned out to be an amazing father, which doesn't surprise me. But this guy talks about his hardships, but how amazing it is to have a dad like his. So it's so much satisfaction from so many different directions. And, and it's amazing to feel I can help this person, the son, because now we're into second generation, and he's not the only second generation client that I have, people that I worked with in the past. That's lovely.
I'm happy for you. Let's end this interview right here, even though I think I could go on for many, many more hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. Where can people find you, and how can they help you with your mission of making the world a better place?
You can find me at guywinch.com, GUYWINCH.com. There's information there. One thing I think people should check out if they're interested is my podcast, Dear Therapists. There are links to it on my website. But it's live therapy sessions. My co-host and I, we do live therapy sessions, and we talk about it. There's a case consultation. We give people very tangible advice at the end of the session that they have to implement within a week. And then they have to report back on how that went. So you get a whole character arc, you get a whole arc within each session, and you'll learn something about yourself from each session. So, and our idea of doing that is to democratize psychotherapy. It happens behind closed doors. We don't quite know what's supposed to happen or what's good, what isn't. So now we have, we're starting to tape season 3 now. We have 40 sessions out there for people to listen to and to learn from. And the messages we're getting is that people, even if it's not related to their issue, they'll learn something about themselves from listening to it. So that's something I will check out.
I will put all of your books and the TED Talks and the links to your great podcast in the article that I'm going to write about you. And right now, I know you have to go. Thank you, Guy, for being on my podcast.
And thank you, Daniel, and thank you to your listeners.
Thank you so much, man.